So I built my Atmos studio about a year ago, and one of the first things that I wanted to get down to the nitty gritty and figure out was how certain elements were panned in a mix. And one thing I noticed between every song is that most artists hardly use the center channel, if at all. And for those of you that might not know what the center channel is, it's basically the speaker that sits directly in front of you in your primary listening position when working in Dolby Atmos. And that's not to say that every song doesn't use the center channel. Some use it for lead vocals, drums, and bass, because when you're working with traditional stereo, it's pretty much creating that phantom center regardless if you're working with a mono source, that usually being lead vocals, drums, and bass, and whatnot. But now that we have the ability to put those mono sources into a mono speaker, creating an actual center instead of a phantom center, why are we not using it? Well, let's take a step back and consider how certain songs were mixed in the first place before Atmos was even a consideration. When you mix a song in stereo, more times than not, a lot of the effects are baked into the audio file. But now whenever you pull these stereo sessions and want to make an Atmos version of it, it's pretty much impossible to separate the effects that could be utilized somewhere else in the mix instead of just being in your stereo left and right. And now when you take that mix session and bring it into Atmos, you can't separate those effects. And basically wherever you decide to put your lead vocal, those effects pretty much stay. Sometimes this can be really good. More times than not, it's really frustrating. Now, I would say between the past 10 and maybe even back to 20 years, a lot of mixing engineers are actually printing their effects on separate tracks, which actually makes things way easier when bringing it into an Atmos session. Because now you can put those effects wherever you want, within reason. Now, you don't always have the opportunity to do this, especially if the effects aren't as exciting as like reverb or delay, and maybe the engineer put a stereo width plugin and decided to print it right there and then. Now, whenever you try to pan that maybe closer towards the middle, towards that center channel, it's going to create a weird effect and it's not going to sound the greatest. But I really don't blame the mixing engineers, because honestly that probably saved them at least a little bit of CPU. When working with a lot of material, you got to utilize as much CPU as you can on the things that are really important. But now whenever you have these vocals that are already spread out to sound wide, you kind of have to leave them exactly where they're at for them to be even usable. Panning these elements closer to that center speaker might cause issues with the binaural, and maybe even within your room if you do it really heavily and put a lot into that center speaker, it just ends up not working out very well. Now, the good thing is with most modern production nowadays is that a lot of artists are considering their music to be produced in the format, so the engineer already is one step ahead and knows the situation. And I think it's super cool to have artists that are working in pre-production that are already making decisions for their Atmos mix, which is really hopeful for the future of the format, honestly. And most of my considerations before modern production mainly involved stereo projects being brought into Atmos. But what are some scenarios that probably don't work well even in a modern production? Depending on the engineer you're working with, especially one that's worked in the stereo format for decades now, might feel weird using that center channel because it just sounds odd. It has been brought up over a bunch of different interviews with even the biggest and baddest professionals out there like Bob Clearmountain, Andrew Sheps, and a bunch more, that the center channel just sounds weird. And where they have worked in the stereo field for so long professionally, it's kind of hard to replicate that phantom center with a real center because it's not the same thing. You're getting a mono source from two speakers at the same time coming at your ears directly versus one speaker that's in the middle that kind of just goes around your face to both speakers at the same time. It's a little different. And I agree to this to an extent because not every song is going to call for a center lead vocal that's just right up in front of your face. It is entirely possible that certain elements don't sound good coming out of a single speaker, even if it is just right dab in the middle. But if you think about it, the film industry has been using the center channel for dialogue since the age of when 5.1 has been around. I do think it is a skill that we should introduce to ourselves as mixing engineers and even producers if we have the opportunity to do so, but I do see why most engineers nowadays wouldn't want to. And another thing I want to bring up about it sounding weird is that you don't also just have the center speaker to worry about. You also have to consider the stereo fold down and even the binaural settings that come with that center channel and how it might affect the binaural mix whenever it's played back through headphones. An example of this is like when you put a vocal in the center channel, it can occasionally sound too close or too loud in the binaural mix or the stereo mix, but in a full Atmos speaker arrangement, it can sound perfect. And even vice versa. Sometimes it might be too quiet or too dull, and you might want to bring it more into that center channel to bring it up and make it louder. I mean, there's a million different ways you can fix this issue, whether you're taking an object off of the wall and putting that signal through multiple speakers, and like I said, with the panning and bringing more into the center channel or away from the center channel, but that's a topic for a different video. One final thing I do want to mention is that not all studio monitors work well as a center speaker. I have a video right here that goes into detail about what exactly the differences between all these different studio monitor types are and how they can be incorporated in different studio types, including the center speaker. I highly recommend you check that out before you go. Cool? Cool. See you in the next video.